Good morning. Happy Friday. Happy last day of first grade. How are you feeling about that? So, we have been reading Who Was Thomas Jefferson? It is written by Dennis Brendel Freyden, illustrated by John O'Brien. We learned that Jefferson was in France, that he had taken over Ben Franklin's job as U.S. Minister to France. He wanted to make sure that the United States and France remained friends, and he kept in touch with important people from France, and he traveled all over the country, but he had come home. Remember? Excuse me. So when he got home, there was a letter waiting from Washington, who had become president. He wanted Jefferson to become Secretary of State. That meant he would oversee the country's friendships with other countries, the relationships with other countries. Jefferson said, no, not interested. Washington didn't give up. He sent him a second letter. He couldn't do without him, is what Washington told Jefferson. Jefferson goes, well, I can't say no to the hero of the Revolutionary War. So he went, and he served as the Secretary of State for 4 years. Now, he was afraid that spies would open his letters, so he invented a device to keep his messages private. He called this a cipher wheel. It enabled him to write in a secret code. There it is. Interesting. Right there. Now, as Secretary of State, his job was to help countries be friends with each other. He needed to help our country avoid problems with England, France, and Spain. Now, he and Treasury Secretary, that has to do with money, Alexander Hamilton, couldn't get along, and it just kind of got worse from there. And finally, Jefferson says, you know what, I'm tired of all this arguing. So he quit, and he went back to his home in Monticello. And he spent the next 3 years quietly working. He remodeled his home. He worked on his farm. He had his slaves plant trees and flowers and so forth. He was also interested in fossil collecting. He was named Mr. Mammoth, because he gathered fossils of those big mammoth, kind of elephant-like creatures from a long time ago. He invented new gadgets. Over the years, his creations, including a new kind of plow and a different kind of sundial. A plow is what breaks up the ground to get it ready for planting. There's a sundial. This was before they had watches. Now, they had watches in Jefferson's time, but it's just the way the sun is hitting the dial, then it'll kind of indicate the time. Now, then George Washington retired. After a second 4-year term was over, so 4 years plus 4 years is 8 years, now John Adams, who was the vice president, hoped to win the election. Jefferson actually was wanting to be elected as president as well, although he didn't even make any speeches. He didn't really want to be president. He wanted John Adams to win, and John Adams did. But because Thomas Jefferson had the second most votes, which is how they did it at the time, then he became vice president. By that time, Thomas Jefferson wasn't a young man. He was 68. So he moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he began serving as vice president. So at first, Jefferson and Adams were old friends, and they got along well enough, but the president and the vice president clashed. That means they started not getting along. So when John Adams ran for re-election in 1800, so did Jefferson, only this time he really, really wanted to win. And he did. Now, he took office in 1801. He was the first president who became the president in Washington, D.C., because then it became our capital. Now, he wasn't a fancy man. He didn't dress fancy. He walked, during the inauguration, he walked from his room he was renting a room in a house. He walked there to the Capitol building and he became president. Pretty simple man. A lot of people came to hear him. Now, he moved into the White House, which was not completed yet, and he turned out to be an excellent national leader. Now, he had long wanted the nation to expand westward toward the Pacific Ocean. So in 1803, he made the greatest land deal in history for $15 million, which is still a ton of money. But considering what he bought with that, it was a great bargain. We bought parts of almost 15 states. I showed you this before. All of those states with a star in it, see, like Texas and Oklahoma and so forth, those all were part of the, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Louisiana Purchase. In 1804, you know that he sent a group of explorers called the Corps of Discovery out to discover the land. What were the two leaders named? Lewis and Clark, right? They traveled from Missouri to the Pacific Northwest. So they traveled, let me show you on my little tiny map. They traveled from St. Louis all the way, you know that they, all the way up here. 15 states, that's amazing. They learned about Western land. They learned about Native Americans. We've been learning about this in the Read Aloud, haven't we? And that group of people helped the U.S. claim even more land. And that became Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. And Washington, Oregon, and Idaho is right next there. So that land right up there in that corner. Now, let's see. And that is all. Oh, one more thing. Jefferson was reelected as president. So he was president 8 years. And then after he was finished being president, he went home and he lived in Monticello for the rest of his life. But, you know, he had an idea about ending slavery, which sounds really interesting because he had slaves, remember? Got them from his dad. Because slaves were considered, people were considered something you buy and sell. What a horrible thought. But remember he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, but yet he had slaves. Now, when he was president, he thought, how could I do this? How could I end it? Even back years before that, he said that freeing slaves was what we should do before we were even a country. And he also saw that he was part of the problem. Now, over the years, he had 400 slaves. How could he do this? Should he end the slaves? End slavery all at once? Let them all be free? Should we do it a little bit at a time? How could we do that? A slave was worth hundreds of dollars. He was afraid to cause a fight. People would be against it. And you'll find out in second grade, it did cause a fight. It caused a battle between people in our own country. Well, we'll learn about that in second grade. We won't get in that today, even though I'd love to. Now, he attacked slavery in 1806, and he asked Congress, the lawmakers, to end it. Now, in 1808, it was illegal against the law to bring any more slaves into the country, and he hoped that slavery would die out, but it didn't. new slaves were brought in, they were smuggled in. That means they were hiding, and then of course people are having babies and so forth. And it wasn't another almost 60 years before slavery was ended. But like I said, when he was done being president, he went home. He said, you know, I'm done. I'm going to return to my people. And that is all I'm going to read out of who was Thomas Jefferson. Such a very interesting fellow. Now, you learned yesterday that Sacagawea met her brother. How did she find her brother? They found some Shoshone people. She was Shoshone. And they went to talk to the chief, and she was interpreting the Shoshone language to Lewis and Clark, but it was dark where they were, and she couldn't see. And then she turned around. She noticed the chief turning his head, and she looked at him. She realized that was her brother. Right. Remember, Lewis and Clark were after 3 things. Okay. Number 1, collect plants and animals to take back to Washington. Number 2, make friends with Native Americans. And number 3, an all-water route to the Pacific Ocean. Remember, the Pacific Ocean is over here, and they started out from here, and the Louisiana Purchases all of this part. So which one do you think didn't happen? Now, your job for today, and we'll get to the vocabulary, but your job for today, think about this. Did they make it to the ocean, and did everybody come back from their trip? And let's look at the vocab before you start watching the video. Canyons, say canyons. These are steep-sided rocky valleys formed by water. So here's the land, and the land would just kind of drop off, and it would kind of go like this, canyon. Communities, you've heard me talk about communities. Those are groups of people who live together in the same place. So your community might be the town you live in if it's a small town, or it could be just an area where you live. Like we have a community of families that live right around Marshall, for instance. Our example sentence is, the city was made up of many small communities, what I was just saying. The next one is contentment, being happy and satisfied. Okay, contentment. Here's our example sentence. The cat stretched in contentment after its long nap. Or I could say, Miss Emmy is content as long as she is on me or next to me, and she's got her face right on my leg. The next one is current. Current. There's different, sometimes words that we have mean different things. Current can mean new, like what is the current news on what we're doing next week, something like that. But in this case, current, same word, different meaning, means a strong flow of water moving in a particular direction. Okay, when the river is going and the water is moving very fast, we could say that's a fast current. And steered is our next word, our last word. Guided or directed the movement of something. So you're steering, like you're steering a car. Okay, that's our example. I steered my car going down the road, or I steered my car into the parking lot. Or this is the one they give in the book, the farmer steered the cattle up the mountain. Interesting. Okay, guess what? Have a wonderful, wonderful summer, and I cannot wait to see you again. I love you. Bye.